Hi. So today I'm going to be talking about the trial, and not really execution, but yeah, the trial of Sir Thomas More. He was an English statesman, was Lord Chancellor of England from 1529, so from Wolsey's downfall, to 1532, when he resigned as Lord Chancellor after refusing to accept the Act of Submission of the Clergy. Well, a bit of background before the trial. In November 1534, some bills were introduced in Parliament that would help secure Percival More's trial and his subsequent execution. These two were the Act of Supremacy and the Treason Act, both passed in 1534. The Act of Supremacy established Henry as the supreme head of the Church of England and formalized the submission of the clergy. There had been two previous religious doctrine things in the Reformation Parliament regarding the submission of the clergy, and these were the Submission of the Clergy, 1532, the Act of Submission of the Clergy, 1532 as well, which formalized the submission, and then the Act of Supremacy, 1534, that said, definitely the head of the Church of England is Henry, and all clergy must obey him. And the Treason Act, which made it a capital offense to say anything that would go against the king, essentially. So Thomas Cromwell and four other advisors went to Thomas More in his cell in the Tower of London and went to interview More. Now, More had been imprisoned in 1534 because he had refused to take the oath of succession under the first Act of Succession. This oath would say that all children of Catherine of Aragon would now be declared illegitimate, so Elizabeth, and the children, Mary, and all children of Anne Boleyn, by this point, I think, Elizabeth and any subsequent children would form the line of succession rather than any of Catherine of Aragon's children, who I think it was just Mary. He refused to take this oath, so he believed that Mary would be next in line, Mary would be next in line, and Elizabeth just wouldn't. And because of this, he was imprisoned, and, Thomas Cromwell, who was now Lord Chancellor since 1532, went to interview him with four other advisors. Well, they told More that Henry demanded to know his opinion on the Act of Supremacy. More said that he refused to meddle in those affairs. He just would not be involved. And, they told him that if he acknowledged his consent to the act, the king might be more reasonable, more merciful. More said, "I said what I said. I'm not going to change my opinion." Well, then in May 1535, Henry became more and more obsessed with punishing his opponents. Well, Bishop Fisher had added in the act that Henry, he would now be head of the church in England. This was added before the Act of Supremacy was passed. As far as the law of Christ allows, that little part, and that made him an opponent to Henry and Henry's Reformation. But the Pope had attempted to protect Fisher because he knew that Fisher, where this one, by the way, was a bishop, and the Pope knew that Henry would persecute Fisher, so he tried to make Fisher a cardinal. Now, the king's men were really quick in doing this. They brought up charges against Fisher and proceeded to execute him before being officially named cardinal. Then More faced a third interrogation, because he had faced one before. Before Cromwell and other councillors. Well, he was asked to give the oath of supremacy, but More said, More didn't say anything. He didn't say it. He retained his silence. So authorities said, okay, let's try another thing. They sent a Solicitor General, Richard Rich, amazing name, I know, to More's cell. And this was to remove his books and writing materials, as well to talk to More. Now, there is a alleged discussion about the king's role. Now, the existence of this discussion is disputed, and I'm going to talk about that later because that became one of the main points in Moore's trial. Well, Moore yet again faced official investigators, and this was even like it was like an interview kind of, but in reality it was a preliminary hearing to determine whether he violated the Treason Act. On June 26, 1535, a special commission was established to hear the case of Thomas More. But of course, they found him like he had violated the Treason Act. So 2 days later, a 4-count indictment charged More with treason, and he would therefore have to go stand trial. And because this was for treason, it's a trial for his life. So the trial. First of all, the opening proceedings. Trial opened in Westminster Hall on July 1st, 1535. There was a jury present of 12 men. However, I don't think that a jury didn't have been there because, well, the verdict of guilty was inevitable, and Moore knew this. Moore knew that once he was sentenced to trial, he knew he wouldn't survive. So, well, because if the jury had said that Moore was innocent, they could have faced imprisonment themselves and face trial for treason and be executed. And they didn't want that, so they obviously knew they had to convict Moore. And Moore knew this. Moore wasn't stupid. Moore knew perfectly well that once he stepped into the trial, he would leave with a guilty verdict. Well, Attorney General opened the proceedings and read the indictment, which consisted of 4 basic charges. I'm gonna talk about these charges in a second. And the Duke of Norfolk asked Moore if he had anything that he could say, because they were giving him a final chance to escape with his life. But Moore, he said, "Guys, I appreciate this is not quoting, by the way. Guys, I appreciate the offer, but in good conscience, I cannot. I stand by what I said." And well, during the whole trial, Moore was seated because his imprisonment had really weakened him, and his family was watching. So the charges, there were 4. First one was the charge of opposing Henry's marriage. Moore, when he was asked about this, he freely admitted that he had told the king his true opinion. And well, to do otherwise, he said that he would have basically flattered his majesty and made him a wicked subject and a traitor to God. And of course, yes, he had to serve Henry, but his own heart told him that he had to serve God, and he couldn't lie to Henry, because that would be lying also to himself and to God, and he couldn't do that. And well, he also said that giving the king an honest answer when asked for it should be hardly treasonous. It shouldn't be treasonous if the king asks for your opinion on something and you respond with an honest answer. That shouldn't be able to be considered as treason. That was the first charge. Then the second charge was the charge of not swearing to recognize the king as the supreme head of the church. So not taking not taking the oath of supremacy. Well, when asked about this matter during the Tower interview, because he was asked about this several times, but especially during the first interview, he said that no law could punish a man for his silence. If he didn't say anything, he wasn't opposing it, he was just not saying anything. So he argued, why charge you with treason if I didn't say I didn't take it? If I didn't say I wouldn't take it, I just didn't say anything. He was then told that his silence was a sign of the malice of his heart. But then Moore responded that he that holds his peace gives consent. The next charge was that while in the Tower, he wrote letters to Bishop Fisher inciting him to violate the Treason Act. Now, the letters in question they could not be produced and they've not been found. Fisher allegedly burnt them. But Moore, because these letters couldn't be found, he insisted that they had there was no way in any part of these letters the law was violated. He also said that what the letters were him telling Fisher that he had followed his own conscience, and like when he was questioned about the matter of heavy supremacy, and he was essentially telling Fisher that he should follow his own mind. Like he should follow his heart and do whatever he sees fit. Now, this is not saying that he should not take the oath. If Fisher did not take the oath, that was because Fisher followed Moore's advice of taking it, like following his heart. If Fisher wanted to take the oath, he would have also followed his heart. And then the last charge was a charge concerning the bell tower conversation with Richard Rich a few days earlier. There was this, like I said, this allegation that Moore had told Rich that Parliament had no power to enact the act of supremacy because that it was essentially saying passing a law declaring God to not be God, and that Parliament did not have the power to do this. The court, in order to answer to these charges, called Rich to testify, and Rich confirmed the charge. He said, yes, Thomas More said this. Now, Moore, when asked about this, rejected Rich's testimony. He said, and I quote, he said that if the Rich's version was true, and I quote, I pray I may never see God's face. And we know how religious Moore was and how he followed his conscience and how he just didn't lie, because that was not, he would be lying to himself and then lying to God. So you can take how this just showed how Rich was flat out lying. Moore was clearly more concerned, and he let this be known to the court about Rich's perjury. He had lied in court, so that was perjury. He was more concerned about that than his own danger. He knew he was essentially dead. So. And he said, look guys, I've always regarded Rich as a liar. I always disliked how dishonest he was. So why would I choose him of all people in England to confide these opinions in? Attorney General, because they couldn't get anything out of Rich and Moore, because that was his word against his. Decided to ask the other men who were present in Moore's cell. Now, these men were present because they were taking the books away when Rich went to visit Moore, but they knew they couldn't say, oh yeah, it was Moore's version, although that was probably true. So instead, in order to not help convict Moore, although he would be convicted, he said that they were too busy stuffing Moore's books and carting them away to pay any attention. So they didn't know. So it was still Moore's words against Rich's. So, the verdict. Well, the jury went away and discussed it for a whopping quarter of an hour. It took them 15 minutes to decide the verdict. Now, I understand that at that point, they had to convict. And they declared Moore guilty on all 4 charges. Well, Lord Chancellor began to pronounce the sentence, but Moore said, wait a second. He interrupted the Lord Chancellor. He had already been declared guilty. He knew that sentence was what's going to happen to him, so he literally had nothing to lose. He reminded the Lord Chancellor that it was customary for defendants to speak prior to the imposition of the sentence. He told the court that his indictment was grounded on a law that was repugnant to God, that this law went against God, and that by allowing him to be declared guilty, they would be breaking God's trust or whatever. He also said that the Parliament lacked the authority to enact any law, not the Act of Supremacy in particular, act any law that would go against the teachings of Christ's Universal Catholic Church. So he's not saying that the Parliament didn't have the power to enact the act of supremacy, but they didn't have any power to enact any act that went against Christ's universal Catholic Church. And he also said that these laws straight up violated the Magna Carta, passed by King John, and the king's coronation oath. Because the king had to take an oath when he was coronated, like serving God. And because this law was, well, going against God, and this was by order of Henry, obviously, well, Henry was violating his own oath. Well, Lord Chancellor asked more that, how come, what do you think about the fact that many bishops, universities, and most learned men of the kingdom found the act of supremacy lawful? More said that if one would take his account of the views to all of Christendom, so not just England, he knew his view would be favored because other countries would have no fear of Henry. It was just Christianity. And more, he said this, but that didn't help. He was still declared guilty, he was still executed. Now, the standard execution, if you were convicted of treason, the standard execution method was hanging, drawn, and quartered, and Thomas More was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, the trial happened, I think it was 6 days before the execution, and a few days before More was executed. The sentence was changed to beheading. Essentially, as a favor, as Henry's way of saying, look, you violated my trust. When you left the office, you refused to take the act of supremacy. You refused to take the oath of supremacy, the oath of succession. But you were my Lord Chancellor, so I'm still going to execute you, but I'm going to execute you in a more honorable way. And that is how Thomas More, his trial and execution. His position in power, his time from 1529 to 1532 is known as the More Interlude. Because, and all of the laws passed in that period were mostly under the influence of Cromwell, even though Cromwell wasn't Lord Chancellor. And that is pretty much it. That's the trial and execution of More. The execution is nothing special. He said that he died a servant of the king, but a servant of God first, or whatever. That's not an exact quote, but along those lines. So he kept his conscience up until the end. He never lied to the people, and he kept true to his beliefs. So that was good. And that is pretty much it. That's everything I can say on this. So thank you for watching, and I hope you liked it. Bye.